All right, this is Marco Palmero, founding director of Ulysses Investments. In this video, I want to share with you a couple of thoughts on our investment criteria and how we select acquisition targets before we actually start our official due diligence process, if we want to call it this way. And I want to do that because I got asked this question quite often about how do you select targets effectively and what kind of parameters you use to make sure the acquisition can be a potential fit for you and the institutions that you're working with. And hopefully this will help people that might be skeptical about small medium sized acquisition, and it will clarify our vision and the concept that we use as a foundation when selecting these acquisition targets. So generally speaking, I think we can break this thing down in three key buckets, and all these buckets have parameters and principles that we follow. Now, the first one are obviously financial, meaning we want to identify whether or not the target is doing well, if it is profitable, if it is growing, if it is performing well. And there's many different criteria that we can use, and I'm not going to go into that in this video because it will be too long. But let's just say that the target itself should be profitable and performing well. Secondly, I would say due to the fact that COVID impacted our lives in many different ways, and I don't really anticipate this situation to change early in the future, you gotta make sure the target had solid performances during COVID and how the business was affected during COVID. Sometimes you find people that feel that the years of the COVID are not really counting, and that sooner or later everything will get back to normal, but that is not actually true. And you really got to make sure that the acquisition itself is consistent, and if it has performed well during COVID, you can also expect that the business will do that in many other recessions, because COVID is arguably one of the worst recession that we've ever seen in recent times. The third element that I will look for is the sector and the service provided. If it is exclusive, if it is difficult to copy and imitate, that is definitely a plus, because it allows us to come in and have a much higher, bigger, should we say, value proposition that we can offer. And so it is very important, because then we can leverage that exclusivity and that competitive advantage that the business has to scale it involved in the ecosystem and the consortium that we're creating. So those would be the three financial components. They're quite generalistic, of course, and there's many details that you got to check below those, but they're giving you a very rough idea of what are the parameters that we look for when selecting those targets. Then we have the internal targets that can be summarized easily with a brand, staff, and ownership. I'm saying that because a lot of other companies or projects might want to change these elements when entering the acquisition and integrating the business into their own infrastructure. But we don't actually do that. We try to keep everything consistent and coherent, because we believe that business that has performed well in the past can be kept as it is. And therefore, again, we try to change as little as possible, also because we know that transition is one of the most difficult times when acquiring a new company, and therefore by changing as little as possible in brand name, ownership, in staff, we have the ability to maintain a high level of stability and have the acquisition perform much better. Then we have the growth targets, the growth buckets, shall we say, that includes other three elements that are basically how this business can be developed. Since we are talking about small medium-sized companies, how can we take it to the next level? Is it there an untapped market that the current ownership is not seeing, that has not identified, that we can tap immediately after acquiring the business? Is there an opportunity to mass market these services? And is the ownership marketing these services at all? Because sometimes they're not even marketing the service. So it is very good opportunity for us to invest in actually increase the performance of the business from day one. And the last thing that I would say is the integration into the ecosystem and the synergies that can be created. Because most of the times when you look at an acquisition, you look at it as a standalone business, while instead you should look at it from our perspective in how it can integrate itself into the ecosystem that we're creating, because it might generate synergies that can increase revenue not only for that particular business but also for the other locations that are part of the conglomerate. So that is a very important factor that can be considered when selecting targets, and these are 9 of the key components that we generally look at when filtering our acquisitions target. And in working here in the UAE, we selected more than 600 targets down to 15 using these parameters. They served us pretty well, and I'm sure they will allow us to always present valuable targets to the people we work with in solid acquisition that can actually come to fruition, because they are built with different criteria and they follow different principles compared to many other models that you see out there.